Welcome everyone to Video Chess Training. This is International Master William Paschall. Today we're going to take a look at an exciting game from the Tata tournament 2016. A lot of strong players in this event, and here we get to see the world champion Magnus Carlsen playing black against Grandmaster Van-Wely. Van-Wely, while one of the lower rated Grandmasters in the tournament, is renowned for his theoretical knowledge. So Van-Wely plays d4, Carlsen plays knight to f6, Van-Wely c4. Loke has been a d4 player most of his career. g6 from Carlsen. Now, I don't know about you, but I think I smell a little bit of Kasparov influence here. Carlsen lately wheeling out to Grunfeld from time to time. g6, knight c3, and d5. And I wanted to look at this game not just from the perspective of it being a great game, and I'm just going to go over a whole game from this tournament at Tata. I like this game because of its theoretical impact. So after d5, white is always searching for a good line against the Grunfeld, but this variation with bishop f4, I think appeals to a strong, aggressive positional player. With the idea of bishop f4, you get your bishop outside the pawn chain. You're often going to follow up with rook c1. You're strengthening your queenside, quickening your queenside development, and that means you're going to take away some of this play black usually gets on the long diagonal because of the bishop on g7. Sometimes in the Grunfeld, your rook on a1 ends up being a hindrance. Your queenside doesn't get developed fast enough. That isn't a problem here in this line. I think white's main idea is to mobilize the queenside quickly. Bishop g7, and now e3. This is not the only move. I mean, white can experiment with older moves like knight f3, or perhaps rook c1 there. Castles, and now rook c1. Consistent idea. Black has ideas to really put pressure on white's center very quickly using the long diagonal primarily. And to accentuate his attack along the long diagonal, c5 is a key idea. In these lines, you see an early c5 very often, the queen coming out to a5. So white preempts this by playing an early rook to c1. This is a theoretical position. c5 is probably the main line for black. But Carlsen plays bishop e6. This move has a pretty long history, but it's in this exact position never really been established as a main line. There are at least 4 moves for white in this position, and well, the game is a great game, I think, all around, but there are other avenues that we should explore. We're looking at this as kind of a theoretical analysis, not merely the analysis of a game from Tata 2016. So bishop e6 was first played by Viktor Korchnoi many years ago in the prehistoric ages, but what often happens, and especially in all the older games, was the position was reached by a different order of moves. White could play here knight f3, and after d takes c, knight g5, bishop d5. This is actually an older main line. There's a lot of theory connected with this position, but I think that both sides have chances there. It's really another story. I'm not sure it's the only way for white to play, and it's been explored in pretty heavy depth. So we're looking for something else for white, not to go into this heavily analyzed line. Other ideas here, though, for white. Alternatives to the continuation by Van-Wely in the game are interesting. Knight f3, an older line. Alternatives here include c5. This was played by Grandmaster Timoshenko in one game, but I'm not overly impressed with this move. It's kind of like a c6 Slav. Black could play c6 with the Slav type counterplay based on b6 and anticipate something like h3, b6, and if b4, black seems to have counterplay with a5. Always tricky attacking the pawn chain when you're kind of on your weaker side, but I think black needs to get counterplay here. So sometimes has ideas of knight e4. So I think in these lines with c5, it's an interesting struggle. It's a positional struggle. It closes the queen side for sure. It definitely takes away the active Grunfeld type of counterplay. But I don't think this position is really to everyone's taste. So c5, although it's playable, white could also take on b6, but I don't think this is a really serious test for black. c5 is a very rare move, but playable. However, black could try something new there. After c5, I don't believe this move has been tried, knight h5. And that would certainly stir up some interesting complications. Knight h5 here. So I think that more exploration is necessary, but c5 remains a very rare move. Knight h5, an untested try for black. Okay, let's go on to the more prominent moves in the position. The most interesting move for white is queen b3, which surprisingly has been played in a number of games. Black normally has played here b6, and the idea is to play c5. I don't know if black can play c5 right away. I was thinking about this and looking at it, but it's a Grunfeld idea. It's very thematic, but I don't think it quite works right away, because queen takes b7, and it just doesn't look like black has enough counterplay here. He's going to be losing a vital pawn on d5 if he plays something like knight on b to d7. The rook sacrifice, or pseudo rook sacrifice, queen b6, which works in some other lines, is probably black's best. But after queen takes b6, a takes b6, this particular version of the position, it doesn't look like white has quite enough counterplay. Or sorry, black has quite enough counterplay for the sacrificed pawn. You could try it, but I really don't think that it's quite sound, but interesting. So queen b6, usually met by b6 when white needs to develop, obviously. Knight f3, c5, and with the pressure on the center, white can't really keep the tension here. So the critical line looks like d takes c5, b takes c5, and I looked at cd, but rook d1 probably preferable. And in this position, it seems that black has enough counterplay with the move queen a5. After queen a5, we reach a imbalanced material situation after c takes d, knight takes d5, rook takes d5, bishop takes d5, queen takes d5, bishop takes c3 check, b takes c, and queen takes c3 check. Here, this position, I'm not sure after knight d2 if black has enough compensation. I think yes, though. I think it's probably just about enough compensation. There's a lot of interesting moves here. Knight c6 is possible, knight d7. So let's say black has enough compensation, but it's certainly playable for white. These are the alternative lines. There's some unexplored variations here and there, but basically that's what happens after queen b3. It's not earth-shaking. So I like the way that Luke played this. It seems correct. Pawn takes d5. Now, of course, knight takes d5. And here is one interesting suggestion of mine. I don't think this has ever been played, but it's possible that it has. There's an interesting line in another variation of the main line Grunfeld exchange where white can play, instead of taking on d5, knight e2. And he can do the same thing here. Knight on g to e2 is an interesting move, and I think this might take some players by surprise. But the idea is to play knight takes d5 followed by the other knight to c3. This variation is untested, but I would imagine that black probably has enough counterplay. But nevertheless, an interesting try and a new idea in this variation. So the game actually continues. Knight takes d5, and here very few examples are really available to reference, but you have to admit that queen takes d5 looks like the more active move for black. This was not played by Carlsen, but it certainly looks reasonable. I mean, he's starting to take the pawn on a2 right away. There's some checks on a5 that can be useful. And if you put this on a computer engine, I don't think that white's going to come up with better than b3, which looks a little weakening, or perhaps a3, which also has its drawbacks. If b3, for example, queen a5 check, I was looking at this, queen d2, kind of like our main line for this. Queen takes d2 check, king takes d2, c6, which is logical. Bishop c4, bishop takes c4, and white could take either way here. But I guess taking with the pawn toward the center looks a little more dangerous. Rook takes c4, not as threatening. B takes c4 allows the idea of rook b1, rook takes b7. And now knight d7, knight f3, rook d8, rook on f to d8, king e2. And I looked at this, and I think black is okay after c5. He has to kind of fix the queen side one way or another. And so it looks slightly better for white, but objectively black is probably fine here after c5. That's kind of our main line. And I don't know, that there's anything wrong with queen takes d5 for black. Carlsen, we don't know how deep his analysis is here. I mean, it could be that it's very scary how deep it is. But it seems like he had this bishop takes d5 prepared. If not, then his instincts are just tremendous. Because Van-Wely had a scary looking initiative in the opening and played very aggressively. But it looks like Carlsen kind of had everything under control, like it was sort of planned in advance. Bishop takes c7. And this wins a pawn. But black has good development to compensate. Not an unusual pawn sacrifice, actually, in the bishop f4 lines of the Grunfeld. Queen d7, bishop g3. I think this is also best. He could play knight f3, but the bishop's going to have to come back, or knight e2 for that matter. The bishop's going to have to come back next move anyway. Bishop g3, and then bishop takes a2. Now in this position, it's interesting. I mean, Carlsen could consider sacrificing a pawn long term with something like knight c6. But I do think that he needs to get this material back. This is his most reliable approach. Bishop takes a2, and as you can see, typical Grunfeld, the queenside majority for black in the end will be a factor, but in the middle game, the central majority for white provides him with good central control. And even now, with his king on e1, he has fairly good king safety, prospect for a central pass pawn in the middle game. Knight e2, this is the same theme we've seen before, with the idea of knight transferring to c3. Much better than routine development with knight f3. Bishop d5, this is where it starts to look like Carlsen had this sort of planned out. Bishop d5, knight c3, and bishop c6. And everything looks, I don't know, it looks a little bit too sort of composed for black. This whole plan of trading the knight on c3, the bishop, sorry, to prevent white from winning a piece with d5. Meanwhile, the knight can go to a6, and black has a fairly harmonious position, despite the fact that white has a central majority. Bishop c6, and then Van-Wely goes really psycho-aggressive, and I think it's strong. I mean, h4, I would be afraid to do it against the world champion, to leave my king in the center and play this all-out attacking style. And it's risky. I mean, believe me, you're leaving your king in the center, and your rooks are not going to be connected. Anytime you do that, you have to be very careful. But I think that it's a brave play, and it's probably the only way to try to play for a win against a world championship caliber player, to play something extraordinary. So h4, bravo for Van-Wely, a very aggressive move. He could have played f3. I think f3 is okay, but maybe he felt his center wasn't all that strong. Black can't play bishop h6 right away because he'll lose the piece with d5. So he'd have to preface it with something like rook d8, and then I guess bishop f2. But nevertheless, I think that the position is unclear. Knight a6 does have options. It's normally a bad square in the Grunfeld, but here it has knight a6, knight b4, where it can come into play. Black can play e6 if the center starts to lunge forward. He can get counterplay with b5. So I think black's in the game, but bishop f2 would, followed by bishop e2 would have been a very sensible and solid way for white to continue. He doesn't have to go with this all-out attacking plan with h4. This is optional. h4, rook d8, strengthening his pressure on the center. Classic Grunfeld kind of central pressure to compensate for white's extra pawn in that vicinity. Queen b3, this is a star move, and this is a key idea of Van-Wely's attack, basically. He's going to use h5 lever, bring some pressure to bear, hopefully with the bishop on c4, and maybe force black to weaken his kingside with e6. This happens in the game. This happens often in the Grunfeld, the kind of controversially necessary yet weakening move e6. And here, Magnus played queen f5, which is an interesting and adventurous move. It does put his queen in a position where it could be possibly vulnerable to attack by pawns, bishops, among other things. But it also stays active and avoids the bishop getting trapped by a pawn move like d5. The alternative is interesting, though, and it should be considered knight a6. Knight a6 is fully playable, and I don't really subscribe to bishop takes a6. I don't think that giving up the bishop should be dangerous for black. So, after this queen f5 choice, here maybe the drawback of queen f5 is the move that Van-Wely failed to try. There's a move that leads to kind of good complications, I think, for white here, which is, instead of this, no, h5 is okay, but after e6, h takes g, low play queen d1. Now, instead of this, these moves I think more or less logical. I don't see any great improvements here for either side. We went through kind of quickly there, but I think e6 is necessary for black, and I think this exchanging on the h-file is difficult to improve upon. But here, Van-Wely made a kind of surprising decision, which wasn't bad necessarily. He has a concrete plan, but it seems inconsistent. I mean, 2 moves ago he played queen b3, and the queen now, closed out by the e6 pawn. He's been unable to get the b7 pawn. Bishop c4 obviously would drop a pawn on g2. It's not that easy a situation, but knight b5 is very tantalizing, and there are some variations that look strong. For example, I mean, black doesn't want to trade his bishop for the knight, obviously. The knight has dangerous threats of knight c7, sometimes knight b6. There's also the idea of rook c5 in some positions. So, for example, if knight d7, white has bishop c7, when knight d6 becomes a very serious threat next move. So, this knight b5 move deserves further exploration. Black can also play perhaps something like knight a6, but take care in these lines because it's looking like white's knight is very, very active and he has a slight initiative. Both rooks have open files. I think this was kind of the logical continuation for Loke, but he found another way to play, which feels a little unnatural, but nevertheless seems decent. Queen d1. Position has changed since he played the move queen b3. Black's queen is now on f5. The f7 diagonal is guarded, so he decides to redeploy his queen. There's several reasons for this. I mean, he could have envisioned b4, b5 for white, but I think primarily the queen is envisioning coming out here to try to set up a battery along the h-file, and it's also envisioning mainly this idea of playing bishop d3, which is going to be a key tempo move to gain control of the center, kick the queen away from f5, make it possible for white to complete, his sort of hand castling and complete his development in general. So queen d1, knight b5 is interesting, queen d1 is reasonable. Knight d7 from Carlsen now. which I think is fine. Knight a6 is also playable, but now he sees the action on the king side. He wants to bring his knight over to where it can kind of influence the center, maybe help to protect his king side. And Carlsen's play cannot be faulted. There are alternatives, but he plays almost flawlessly for most of this game. Bishop d3 now. And I guess the following move is pretty much forced. Queen a5. Active queen could be attacked by rook a1, but it's got a good square now. Several good squares, but mainly b4, where it's going to bother this pawn on b2. And it can also go to b6. Let's see now. Queen a5, king f1, guarding g2. And possible white could play some dramatic move like queen g4 there, but I think he wants to get his king off this diagonal, not sacrifice anything. Knight f6 now, which seems correct, and bishop e5. This isn't white's only move. Instead of bishop e5, I think that there were many moves white can play here. Rook a1, perhaps with the idea of queen b4, queen c2, defending the b2 pawn, shoring up the knight, and threatening sacrifices on g6. Very, very interesting sacrifices on g6. For example, if knight d5, which is a natural move, bishop takes g6, would lead to a tantalizing attack for white. Possibly a very strong, possibly decisive attack for white. So Carlsen would have to be careful here. I think that's probably the best for white. Alternative moves would be maybe rook h4 or rook, a little more solid looking rook h3. So bishop e5, which was okay, but Carlsen of course found the best possible move here. The extremely active and aggressive rook c8, developing the last piece, and then queen d2. So again, I think rook a1 deserves consideration, and still queen b4, queen c2 with ideas of this, but not as appealing now that the rook has come to the c-file. Somehow not quite as appealing. Again, alternatives for white, rook h3, again rook h4. I think white has choices in this position, but the knight is bothering him. I mean, it stopped his queen from going to g4. It also can threaten to go to h5 sometimes. So Carlsen playing very solidly. He's developing his pieces while creating a minimal amount of weaknesses. This is a well-played game. And queen d2. This is a kind of tricky move by Van-Wely. I mean, yes, he's starting a cheapo here. Bishop takes f6, but it doesn't actually win a piece. You know, when you go knight e4, black will exchange on d2. All it would amount to is trading some pieces. So there's no concrete threat. I think Loke wants to shore up the b pawn. He wants to shore up his knight, create some tactical possibilities of knight e4. But also, he sees the following variations. When his queen will infiltrate via h6, when these bishops are inevitably traded. He could also threaten e4. Simply, he's threatening e4, followed by bishop takes f6 in some lines. Carlsen obliges, he lets him trade off. This is a very brave move, and Carlsen's play is amazing here. Knight g4, dangerous looking, exchanging the dark squared bishops, but bishop takes g7. This is also not the only move. You could retreat, but it seems inconsistent to play bishop g3 now. Bishop takes g7, king takes g7, and f3. I mean, it's hard to suggest anything else. Black is threatening to actually take over the h-file, and white will be mated along the h-file if white isn't acting fast enough here. So f3 is practically forced. When Carlsen could play knight f6, I think knight f6 is equal. And basically, Magnus probably knew that. He probably analyzed this, said, okay, knight f6, e4, threatening mate with queen h6. When black has choices, he has interesting moves, knight h5 maybe, or the solid rook h8. And in this line with rook h8, king f2. I think this position looks pretty equal. If maybe queen b6, white can guard by moving his bishop. He can guard his pawn on d4, and black has to constantly watch out for invasions at h6. So it's not a dead equal position, but it's a position where it seems like the balance is fair and equal. Both sides have the same amount of chances, but it's pretty balanced. But Magnus wanted more. That's why he won this game. I mean, he kind of wanted to win more than Van-Wely. I had the feeling. Queen g5. I mean, who would think of this, sacrificing a piece here? This is amazing. He sacrifices a piece for 2 pawns and a better structure with threats of getting the 3rd pawn back. It's a pretty crazy and interesting, wild idea, you know. And we got to give Magnus credit for playing for a win in a position where it looked like he had to draw at best. So, queen g5, exclamation question mark. Pawn takes g4, rook takes d4. This is the idea. So this is 2 pawns. This g pawn will be pawn number 2, basically. 2 pawns for a piece, with Van-Wely's king marooned in the center, and white's pawn structure in tatters. He has just isolated pawns. But nevertheless, white's position retains a certain amount of harmony. I mean, all of his pieces are pretty active. Even the rook on c1 has open lines. His king is safe, just safe enough. So it was a marginal sacrifice by Magnus, kind of a practical decision, almost a Tal-like sort of sacrifice to stir up complications and put the maximum pressure on the opponent. Rook takes d4, and here Van-Wely played adequately, but the strongest move was found by some computer engines pretty quickly. Rook c2. This is not like the first move you look at, but it makes sense because it protects the queen on d2. I mean, it threatens to win the rook. These pieces guard each other laterally, the rook on c2, the queen on d2, and it defends laterally all the way across. So you avoid hanging rook on c1, you avoid hanging queen on d2. This is a good move. But Van-Wely played the second best move, and which is quite logical, also guarding the queen and putting the king on a slightly safer square. So this is adequate. King e1, queen e5, pinning the pawn, knight e2, guarding against queen g3, check. Magnus takes the pawn, and now e4, threatening queen h6 check. And here, this is a very dangerous threat. Here Magnus has an okay game. I mean, the jury is still out on what the evaluation is. We'll cop out and say about equal chances for both sides. But after g5, I don't know if he didn't like the fact that Van-Wely can trade queens. Somehow I don't think that was necessarily an issue, because he's winning this pawn on g2. White has to kind of lose a 3rd pawn, you know, so it looks like black has good chances, and trading queens is not a major issue. He should have winning chances in the ending after queens are traded. Both sides have some kind of chances. But the balance is 3 pawns for a piece. It's perfect material balance. But g5 is necessary. Carlsen blunders here with rook takes g2. Okay, it was easy to kind of not see all the lines, but this is an amazing position now. Queen h6 check. Van-Wely is winning, completely winning, but he has to find the exact line. Queen h6 check, Carlsen plays king f6, and this is white to move and win. It's a little tricky. I mean, you could play like rook f1 check. Van-Wely played here rook c3, which is a weird move. I don't know what the time situation was. Rook c3 is okay, it's like a solid move, but this situation where you should look at the forcing moves first. Rook c3 is not a forcing move. So rook f1 check doesn't seem to do anything after king e7. It looks like black is okay here. But queen h4 check maybe we missed something here. Maybe Look didn't see e5 check after queen g5. Maybe he didn't see all the winning lines that are possible here. So if king goes back to g7, this check here on h7, and we're going to win a rook. Next move with queen h8 check. So that's decisive. If the king goes back, yeah, so, alright, if g5, this is another line. This is an important line. The problem is the rook on g2. Without the g5 square, the rook actually gets trapped. Queen h3. And this rook will fall. Obviously, black is also pinned along the c file, so he can't take the pawn on e4. Black has nothing better than rook takes e2 check when the position is winning for white. It's not that easy, and I'm sure Magnus would put up the maximum resistance, but it's a significant material advantage, something like a rook for 3 pawns. So I don't think Luke, failed to see that. I'm not sure. Maybe he missed queen h3. Maybe after g5, he missed queen h3. Maybe he missed queen g5 check, queen g5 e5 check, which is an amazing move. In all lines, black is lost again. Notice how everything's protected. The rook is protected, the g1 square is protected. So if king g7, again, we just simply check and win a rook with king f8, queen h8 check. And if king e7, again, you just happen to win here with queen b4 check, king d7, queen d6 check, king e8, and rook h8 mate. So all the lines just get mated for black and lose a rook. And finally, the most beautiful line is king takes e5, queen d4 mate. So the star piece is the knight on d2 that protects everything that's important in this position. So Van-Wely missed a win, and instead he played this holding move, rook c3. After that, Carlsen cranks up the pressure again. It should probably be a draw, but he just keeps trying to win. Rook d8, king e7 was also okay there. Queen h3, maybe queen h4 check, a little more accurate. But notice now Carlsen's not in danger. He has the g5 square. I should point out one last thing that you might have been asking. In this line, after queen h6 check, king f6, queen h4 check, black could play rook g5, but rook g1, and black is in Zugzwang in this position. He is literally in Zugzwang. So there's no way for black to survive. He doesn't have any moves. White will eventually win material. Maybe Look missed that. Anything's possible. So in the actual game, he holds with rook c3. Black plays rook d8, and then queen h3. And he finds that square and the right idea, but doesn't do anything now that the g5 square is available to black. Queen g5, and black has the initiative again, and he has 3 pawns for a piece. Rook f1, and then the king is safe with king g7. Queen f3, and here Magnus makes another little mistake. He should play f5, and I guess he was reluctant to weaken the king's structure, castle structure around there with f5, but it makes a lot of sense. Well, you have this great pressure on the diagonal. It stops all the play on the file. But hard to say. He defended with rook d7, and here Van-Wely missed another difficult move to find, but he was on the right track. He played knight f4. Sorry, rook f2 is okay. Rook g4. He played knight f4. But this idea of knight takes e6 check with infiltration along the f-file would lead to draws in a lot of positions. But black has the move queen h4 now, pinning the rook on f2. But if Look had played instead knight d4, which is a sort of double threat, knight d4, threatening knight takes e6 check, and threatening to eliminate this dangerous bishop on c6, white would be okay after knight to d4. So the threat is to play knight takes e6 check. If black plays something like queen h4 here, for example, knight takes e6 check, pawn takes e6 check, queen f8 check, king h7, rook f7 check, not possible. That's the point of the queen on h4. So here, we would play knight takes c6 in this position after, if queen h4, knight takes c6. That's the idea. One way or the other, if black doesn't play queen h4, we're threatening knight takes e6 check. If rook takes d4, we're threatening queen takes f7 check, which is at least a draw by repetition. So Van-Wely holds after knight d4. Probably he would hold. He would simplify a lot, and I think the position is holdable for white. Instead, he played knight f4, and then queen h4. It looks like Magnus is winning now. One last inaccuracy from white after bishop e2. I'm not sure, what he could have really done better, but it's really bad now. Rook g1 check, bishop f1, and king g8. Instead of king g8, e5 is very strong for black in this position. e5 looks very strong. Magnus played king g8. It's also okay. And then knight e2. And I guess this is like the final mistake, which walks into a forced loss. Knight e2, rook takes f1 check. Magnus not missing like simple sequences of tactics. He's brutal. Rook takes f1 check, king takes f1, rook d1 check, king g2, and bishop takes e4. It's an ugly end to the game, and it looks like white was crushed, but white wasn't crushed. White had an enterprising and interesting advantage in the opening. He played aggressively with h4, h5, created winning chances for himself, and then Carlsen actually went crazy with a very risky piece sacrifice that, in truth, was at best unclear. Van-Wely misses a win after Magnus goes astray, and then misses probably a draw, basically, only to lose in this final position where everything went astray. But I thought a great struggle, evidence of Carlsen's fighting spirit, because the average player would have shied away from making such a radical sacrifice as the knight on g4, the way he sacrificed the knight on g4. Like playing for a win at all costs against a strong player like Van-Wely, very risky thing to do. Just about pushing the envelope, but Carlsen somehow managed to come up with a win. An instructive opening, interesting line where I think there's room for further exploration. This was International Master William Paschall here for Video Chess Training. Thanks for joining me. Don't forget to like and subscribe on YouTube, and we'll be back with more interesting games, analysis, and also uploads of live play online. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.